So I think what happens in a case like that, the church has to be very careful in such circumstances because it doesn't want to say that suicide is okay. What I have done personally in the past is I will not have a person who's committed suicide brought to the church for the funeral, but I will do the funeral in the funeral home, for instance, because we pray for that person, because we don't want to give the message that suicide is a light matter. Okay, sometimes the only thing that keeps someone from committing suicide is the fear of the rejection from the community that they will experience. So the community has to maintain a strong stand against suicide, but we have to be very careful about saying we know for a fact that everyone who's committed suicide is damned for eternity. We don't know that because we really don't know what's gone on in a mind that can be very disturbed at the point of suicide. So is it our duty to pray for those who committed suicide? It most certainly is. And I think that even if we don't have, the full-blown church funeral, we still should pray for that person and offer prayers. It's up to God. It's our duty to pray for that person. It's not our duty to pass the judgment. Okay? But on the other hand, it's our duty to maintain the witness that suicide is not an option for a Christian. And, because, euthanasia, which is really a sort of sanitized form of suicide, is becoming more and more acceptable to people. We don't want to give that idea that that's an acceptable option. Not at all. But if someone in despair or lack of, clear ability to make moral choices falls into this horrible end of suicide, it's our duty to pray for them and reserve the judgment. That belongs to God. Father James.
We've often used the language of purification, illumination, and theosis or deification in this process of moving from the struggle that we're experiencing here in this life to a perfect union and communion with God. Mm-hmm. And for most of us, we're stuck at the process of purification. I think it's fair to say that most of us, when we depart this life, will be stuck at that level.
Yes, if we even get that far.
The question I have is, in the afterlife, how is the movement taking place in terms of moving through illumination and theosis? Is it automatic? You go,
right?
Or is there some sort of a process of healing, not in terms of the conscious, but in terms of the active desire that we have to sin in specific ways that we have not resolved in this life? That is, if I desire to sin, even as a Christian, when I die, do I continue to desire that sin? Or is it automatically somehow, magically or whatever, taken away from me, from within my heart?
I mean, obviously I'm not a spiritual father, so I don't know. But I will say this. I can only give a partial answer to that because I don't know. I'm not privy to these spiritual realities. The one thing that a lot of these writers do write about is that there is a continuation of spiritual growth after death. There is a spiritual increase that can happen after death. What that means, I'm not exactly sure. But let me give you one proof of it. Just think every time we offer the Eucharist, who do we offer it especially for? Especially our most holy, most pure, most blessed and glorious Lady, the Theotokos and ever Virgin Mary. Think about that. The first person for whom we pray among the dead when we offer the liturgy is the Theotokos. Now, if there's anyone who has approached this stage of, the perfection of humanity, it's the Theotokos, and yet her growth is not yet ended. All right? So we certainly will continue to grow as well. Now, what that means, I'm not exactly sure, and I'm not sure anyone's sure. But one thing I know is that the prayers that we offer for the dead, and we'll talk about this more tomorrow in a systematic way, tends to that spiritual increase. Is there a healing of the soul after death? I think in certain ways, yes, there can be. In other ways, no. And I'll talk about that tomorrow a little bit more, but it's a fascinating question. I do think, though, that the point that I can state with a fair amount of certainty, because it's not my point, but the point of these fathers and the liturgical text that we use, that there is an eternal spiritual growth. We never become God in the sense that we lose our individuality and become fused into God, so to speak. But there's an ever-deepening growth toward God in the way we understand. This is what continues to give us joy for all eternity. It's intensification of the experience of God. Yes?
This might be going backwards a little bit to yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
I had an aunt who was in a coma for 3 months before she finally died after an operation. And I remember a young woman when I was a child who was in a car wreck, and her name was Stella McGilberry. And this sticks in my mind because my mother, we prayed for this woman every night, and she was in this coma, and her elderly parents took care of her. And I guess she eventually died after about 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Or 15 or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. And I don't think these are unusual stories, and I don't think that they were unusual even in ancient days before we had this modern medicine.
Right.
Is there any writings or discussions among the church fathers about whether there's any of even though these people are not dead,
Right.
Their soul has not departed the
Right.
body, whether there's any educational activity, any noetic activity, and something going on besides their just being asleep. Anybody written on that or talked on that?
I don't. Boy, is that a great question. That is exactly the kind of question that will keep me up at night. In addition to black bears keeping me up at night. That's a great question because I don't know of any writings specifically, but I would say, remember the one story I read yesterday from Metropolitan Erotheus' book, where he talks about a monk who was in this in-between stage between life and death. His spirit, his nous, was somehow elevated out of the body, but he knew he was not dead because remember, he even heard them measuring him for a coffin. All right? In other words, I think that a soul in that kind of state of coma is obviously not departed the body because the body's still alive, and yet somehow it's in a stage intermediate between life and death. And there probably is a process that's going on of discernment in that time. This is just my opinion. I don't know of any writing on this, but it seems to me that this is the kind of intermediate stage that, where some kind of reflection, self-assessment can go on. I've never found a text that said this explicitly, but I've been told this by my spiritual father in particular, that one should not pray for a quick death, but a death where, one has time to sort things out and, come to peace in terms of conscience. It would seem to me that someone who's in that extended state of coma is not without noetic awareness, and there is a process of adjustment that's going on there. So I would say when death finally came for such a person, it's usually a very peaceful kind of exit. I don't know whether that was the case in these cases, but God knows what he was experiencing in that state. My hunch is he didn't have any peace, but we don't know that. Even I don't know about Stalin even, So, yes, Father.
What do you mean by noetic awareness?
This is the nous, perceiving the presence of God. Okay? You remember this highest aspect of the soul? The nous is that part of the soul that perceives. It's the eye of the soul that perceives the presence of God and things divine, and therefore is the way that the conscience judges itself. It's not the appetites or the intellection of the soul, but that perception of spiritual reality. So noetic just being the adjective derived from nous. That's why I went through that long thing about the nous, because this noetic awareness, as you see, is really important in discussing this stuff. How many do we have time? 5 minutes? Okay.
Are you going to tell your personal story?
Oh, 5 minutes. Okay. Here goes. I hate talking about myself. My journey to orthodoxy is really something that was quite natural and not at all forced. I grew into orthodoxy. My entering orthodoxy was not a snap. It was a gradual process. I was raised in western Pennsylvania, a mill town, Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, which small mill town. When I was growing up, was actually quite healthy. And I was fortunate enough to be raised in a really stable Catholic home. And I've never regretted being raised as a Catholic in my childhood. I had good parents who were disciplined in their religious practice, but not at all fanatical, who made sure that we learned and were very careful about forming us year to year. I was very fortunate to have good priests in the parish when I was growing up. We had a few crazies, but they were also helpful to me in a lot of ways. And it was a good childhood. And I also had experience with the Eastern Church, even when I was a Catholic, because in Western Pennsylvania, in the Holy Land, Byzantine, Greek Catholicism, and Orthodoxy are really very well represented. My godmother, for instance, is Ukrainian Greek Catholic. Okay? My mother, even though both of my parents are ethnically Italian, grew up in a Ukrainian neighborhood. And so she would go to Vespers and to liturgy with my aunt, I call her, my godmother. And so, this was always part of my religious landscape. Not only physically did you see banya domes and domes of Orthodox churches in the western Pennsylvania countryside. I mean, I lived with people who lived this life. It was always something that I was always familiar with. And I would go to liturgy at the Ukrainian Catholic Church. And the one thing sometimes we deprecatingly call Eastern Catholics uniots, and this is sort of a way for Orthodoxy to show its contempt for Byzantine Catholicism. But I have to tell you, Byzantine Catholicism has been instrumental in leading countless people into the Orthodox Church. Originally, these churches were formed to lead Orthodox into the Roman Church, but the funny thing about a bridge, it can lead the other way too. And this is the way it worked for me. This is the way it worked for me. So I have never had any animosity toward my Roman Catholic upbringing or to, the Eastern Catholics I knew. By the time I graduated from college, I was very interested in Orthodoxy because I used to take what I called sanity walks. I was an undergraduate at Harvard, and so I used to take sanity walks out of the really egghead atmosphere of the Harvard campus into the town. And I remember once I ran across a church right near City Hall in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It says St. Mary Orthodox Church. I said, now, isn't that peculiar? Because growing up in Western Pennsylvania, I would have expected to see a sign that said, St. Mary Russian Orthodox Church, St. Mary Greek Orthodox Church, St. Mary Ukrainian Orthodox Church. This had no ethnic qualifier. And so I went to liturgy there. Because I didn't miss. I always had this natural feel. A good friend of mine says you were destined to be Orthodox because there's something in you that resonates with this style of spirituality. And I went into the church. Absolutely everything was in English. The priest was a former Lutheran who was a great preacher. I was used to that's one thing I have to say about my Catholic upbringing. I was used to really bad preaching. All right. And to go into this church, a highly liturgical church with a phenomenal preacher. And I remember feeling absolutely transfixed, like I'd been nailed to the spot. And this was the beginning of a process that was going to lead me to Orthodoxy. This was when I was a sophomore in college, I guess. And because I'm a very loyal person by temperament, and I was Catholic at the time, what did I do? I said, let me try this in the Melkites, the Melkite Greek Catholic Church. The Melkites are the Middle Eastern Catholics, for whom I had great respect. I had a great experience with the Melkites. And I graduated from college and was lucky enough to win a fellowship called the Sheldon Fellowship, money left by some rich Harvard alumnus in the 19th century who was convinced that the Harvard man, to be truly well educated, could not only learn from books, but had to travel the world. So this was in the 70s, I got $5,000 to travel for a year. Now imagine that. $5,000. And the one stipulation is you weren't allowed to enroll in a program. So you couldn't study formally. You had to travel. So I bought my student rail pass. I got my backpack, packed everything up, and left the United States in May and traveled, beginning in Ireland, down to Wales and England, France, from France to Spain and Portugal, back up again through Spain to France. Then I went to Belgium and to the Netherlands and down to Germany, which I could stay only for 2 weeks because it was so expensive. Then to Italy, and from Italy to Israel. I traveled for an entire year. When I got tired of a place, I packed my stuff up. I got out my student rail pass and went on to the next town. I learned how to economize in the best way possible, which means you learn to take the night trains because you can sleep and not have to pay for a place to sleep at night. You learn how to live on a shoestring. It was wonderful. It was the best year of my life. And I had what the Germans call the Wanderlust in the worst way. I had Wanderlust that was incredible. And I literally traveled through these countries and met up with some of the most incredible people I could ever have met. Mr. Sheldon was absolutely right, by the way, And in traveling across Europe and into the Middle East, I always checked out the Eastern Christian communities there. And I found myself feeling much more a part of these communities than the Roman Catholic churches that I had visited. When I finally got to the Middle East, which was the Melkite heartland, okay, because thanks to the ineptitude and the extreme stupidity of the Greek Orthodox hierarchy in Jerusalem, and I'm glad this is on tape, most of the people, and I will say it louder if you'd like, because of the ineptitude and scurrilous behavior of these people, many of the Orthodox have been alienated into the Greek Catholic Church in the Middle East, the Melkite Church, but that makes for a very vibrant community in the Melkite communities. I was Melkite at the time. So it became obvious to me that this is where I belonged. And so when I sadly had to return to life in the United States after my year of wandering, it was obvious to me that I was going to study for the priesthood in the Melkite Church, which I did. I did a master's at the University of Notre Dame, and then I went on to do a doctorate of ministry at Catholic University, and went back to Harvard Divinity School to do an academic master's in preparation for my PhD. And it was at that point that I felt the inevitable conflict that I think most Eastern Catholics feel, that we used to describe ourselves as Eastern Orthodox in communion with Rome, but the ecclesiology, the conflict of ecclesiology between Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism created a tension that made me realize, I'd use a much more colorful expression if I were in a sort of, informal setting, I had to decide what to do. Okay? And the expression I was going to use. And so what I decided to do is I decided I had to become Orthodox. So I did not leave the Roman communion, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Melkite Church in particular, with any animosity whatsoever. And I still maintain my friendship with all those people, and I just cannot abide when Orthodox take swipes at their former traditions, because we are who we are by virtue of where we came from. All right? And I'm never ashamed of that. And, but once you come to Orthodoxy, all of the trite sayings, about coming home and the heart finds its true home and all the rest of that schlock that we're constantly spewing around, it's really true. I guess that's why they call them truisms, because they're true. And, I think one of the things that attracted me to Orthodoxy, and this is what it sort of links up to all of this, that Orthodoxy to me, what exactly keeps most people from the Orthodox Church is what attracted me to it. For instance, you look at the Roman Catholic Church. Man, there's an organized institution in the world. When the Pope speaks, everyone listens. It's a really well-organized body. I'm really suspicious of institutions. So I needed a church that wasn't that way. All right? So, people say, how can you be someone who's a servant of organized religion? To which my response always is, I'm not a servant of organized religion. I'm a servant of the most disorganized religion on the face of the earth. I'm Orthodox. Okay? The other thing that really attracted me to Orthodoxy was that I liked the fact that despite the extreme seriousness with which Orthodoxy took things, they did not overdefine things. They didn't get too technical in the description of doctrines and dogmas. And that really attracted me because there was a reticence on the part of Orthodoxy to say, we just don't define certain things. I believe as an Orthodox that Mary, after her death, was translated into heaven. Okay? But that's not a dogma that I'm forced to believe as an Orthodox. It's a theologumenon. It's a pious tradition that I embrace willingly. And when you get to matters about death, and I'll talk about doctrines like purgatory and limbo and such tomorrow, I think the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church are on the same page about their doctrine of the afterlife in this sense. For them, the major experience, day to day, year to year, century to century, is that we pray for our dead. Both Orthodox and Roman Catholics do that. The theology follows practice to a large extent. And to some extent, they had to explain why we pray for our dead. And the difference between the explanation that the Orthodox come up with, which is what we've been describing at length the last 3 sessions, we'll conclude tomorrow, and what Roman Catholicism does really shows the different spirit, okay? The much less technical, much less juridical, much less precise, much less mechanical explanations of the Orthodox Church really enticed me. Another thing that really enticed me, of course, was the liturgy. I mean, let's be honest. I was tired of liturgy becoming, and I'm not one of these fanatics that say, Vatican II was the entrance of the Antichrist into the world and all that stuff. I don't believe that. But I do believe that liturgy that has become more focused on the personality of the celebrant and entertainment is something that I did not want in worship. It's funny that an Orthodox liturgy celebrated in a ramshackle shed with bad music and a priest who is not a good liturgizer is infinitely more transporting than most of the Western liturgy I had known. And I think that that's really what drew me in that regard. And of course, not to be underestimated, another thing of Orthodoxy that really attracted me was the food. There is something really to commend Orthodoxy to the stomach. And for those of us whose God is our belly, I mean, there is something that really attracted me there. I know there are some people here who are considering Orthodoxy, and I've always taken a very frontal approach. I am not someone who believes in selling potential converts to the faith a false bill of goods. Orthodoxy has warts galore, more than all vats of compound W could not take care of. And I think it's important for us to recognize those, admit to them, not gloss them over, not engage in some kind of, rhetoric, official line that we're supposed to, give as a way of covering over our real problems. But one thing about Orthodoxy, it is a struggling faith. I mean, sometimes because of foreign oppression, because of external pressures from our enemies, sometimes and usually because of our own stupidity and ineptitude. We have created a real struggle in this church of ours. But there's something real about it. And underneath all of that, if I can use the technical term, crap, you get the vision of the gem. And that's what keeps me Orthodox. Believe me, it would be so much easier to be elsewhere where there are many more resources and much more political power and much more persuasion that I would have by virtue of connections. We are not a powerful church, and we're not a particularly scholarly church, that's for sure. And we're not a particularly resourced church. We're a church that does a lot of dumb things, but somewhere underneath all of that, there's something that's true. And you know that in your gut. And it's like when you love someone, you love them despite their faults. Sometimes you even love them because of their faults. All right. And that's what brought me here. I am not a fire breather in the sense of, I shake my fist at the bill of goods. I think I was malevolently sold in my former years. I don't believe that at all. God, for whatever purpose, has led me to where I am.